Hello, my name is Alora Wilder, and I did option 3 for the final project, which is the super Freakonomics analysis, and 2 empirical article reviews. So yeah, we'll go through that together. The question number 1 was, on a per mile basis, is it more dangerous to drive drunk or walk drunk? I found this question a bit insane, but I'll get into that a little bit later in my third point. So technically, if you are accounting for pedestrians and bystanders that could be in either accident, the book details that a drunk walker is 5 times more likely to be killed than a drunk driver. And then if you remove the pedestrians and the passengers included in that, they're 8 times more likely to be killed in a drunk walking accident than a drunk driving accident. I personally had never heard of a drunk walking incident, but like I said, I'll get more into that. So I did kind of detail that the difference in risk is significant, but both situations are extremely dangerous. So comparing the two is kind of like comparing Honeycrisp apples and Granny Smith apples. The results are somewhat similar, but I mean, they're both dangerous, so it's just kind of using common sense for that. The analysis was kind of just like a generalized statistic analysis of how many people are driving or of driving age, and how many of those people are walking on average. So it seems like they're only including the people that are of driving age in these statistics, which I understand, but I also realize that might also be a little exclusionary. Going through all of that, there's approximately 43 billion miles walked each year by individuals of driving age. Using these individuals as our sample population, we can assume that 1 out of every 140 of these miles is walked drunk. And this is a correlation drawn by the proportion of miles driven drunk. This led to the conclusion, and this seems kind of blown out of proportion to me, that approximately 307 million miles are walked drunk each year. I mean, again, all of the statistics for this question are kind of estimations, and just kind of like best guesses based off of data of, probabilities, which I guess technically is what statistics is, but I don't know. It just seemed like a lot of this was just kind of like a guessing game for this. I ended up with the answer of a drunk walker is 5 times more likely to be killed than a drunk driver on a per mile basis. I found that kind of interesting, but as I stated for my final point, that I found results really bizarre. I had never heard of a drunk walking accident. The text does state that it does not account for the chance that a friend may intervene before you start walking home drunk or driving drunk. I would be interested to see firsthand accounts and actual data regarding drunk walking accidents rather than just estimated variables based on like overall population and probability. I would love to be able to read the police reports on that one. But moving on. How is a street prostitute like a department store Santa? So this is a pretty long section, so I tried to kind of break this down a little bit to just kind of the meat of the conversation. So what is the answer to that? Supply and demand for prostitution have changed drastically throughout history, and the trends and markets have changed with it. Much like the seasonal demand of a department store Santa, prostitution also has its busy seasons. Family reunions are common in America, and researcher Venkatesh, which most of this data comes from him, states that women in prostitution tend to raise their prices by 30% around the 4th of July weekend, as many people visit home to be with family and friends and find themselves in a lonely state of mind. Women will often not prostitute themselves all year round, but will only around 4th of July weekend, just due to the high demand, and they'll make more during that time than they will working all year round. How did we use statistics to answer this question, and how could it possibly spin a story? Researcher Venkatesh asserted himself in the prostitution scene in a few different neighborhoods in Chicago, Illinois, which I didn't realize is one of the highest rated areas of prostitution in the US. He was able to hire retired prostitutes to record some data for him regarding the demographics of those receiving services and the going rates for certain services. Those first-hand accounts yielded data to show that women who work in the sex industry year-round will not make nearly as good of wages as one might have in past decades, especially those who do not have a pimp to enforce strict policies and pricing that the customers must abide by. Chicago obviously is a very big, large market for prostitution. It would be a loss of data to not take into account other states' going rates for services and the price of protection for women in these positions. Obviously, Chicago is a really good example, so I can't disregard the data completely, nor would I want to. I think it's very important, but I think it just would be really interesting to see other states and kind of how they land compared to Chicago. The price discrimination excerpt on page 54 was really intriguing to me. It made me kind of sad. White customers will have to pay the most compared to other ethnically diverse customers, and I do wonder if this is based on the fact that the prostitutes themselves are non-white and there's some sort of implicit bias there, or if it's solely based on the trend of white customers who are willing to pay more for illicit services. Like maybe just innately white customers are willing to pay more than any other race. This is the part that I found heartbreaking. The average discount of $7 is applied if the sex worker is paid in drugs rather than cash. If a sex service takes place outdoors, as the prostitute has no stable accommodations, the discount averages to about $6.50. This last part is horrible to me, but a customer who wears a condom for sexual service will get a $2 discount. A customer protecting the prostitute and themselves gets a discount rather than just being the norm in any situation in a sex service industry. And yeah, it kind of made me sad for vulnerable sex workers. Question number 3. How much good do car seats do? So the data represented in this excerpt divides the inquiry into separate responses for 2 distinct age brackets. In major accidents, lap and shoulder belts demonstrated equivalent effectiveness to car seats for children between the ages of 2 and 6. In minor accidents, car seats were 25% more effective in preventing injuries when compared to seat belts. Rather than asking the parents of children who had been in a car accident, because they're traumatic retelling, they might dramatize things that could be biased and possibly skew data and reports taken of the accident. Researchers did a live action test with 4 dummies, 2 the size roughly the size of a 3-year-old and 2 the size of a 6-year-old. One of the 3-year-old dummies was in a properly installed car seat, the other with a lap and shoulder belt. The only difference with the 6-year-old trial was that this one was in an age-appropriate safety seat and the other was still wearing a seat belt. And that was the same for both the 3 and the 6-year-old. One of them was in a seat belt, one of them was in a car seat to test the effectiveness. Impacts to the chest and the head of the dummies were assessed after each crash test, and it was found that the seat belt performed just as well as the car seat. Researchers took the experiment further than the fatal crashes that resulted in child death. The minor injuries were not reported. This is only kind of like fatal accidents in the fatality analysis reporting system, with crash reports from 2 states, New Jersey and Wisconsin, and a nationally representative database detailing both major and minor accidents. The Wisconsin data linked each crash to hospital discharge information that detailed the extent of each crash's injuries. These reports detailed more than 9 million different crashes, and having such a large sample can help determine whether the results are significant to prove or disprove the hypothesis that car seats are more effective than seatbelts. Data could be used and abused by sharing stories and statistics that are not entirely accurate or tell the whole story. Kind of talking about how those traumatic retellings from parents could definitely kind of skew reports and therefore kind of skew data later on. Improper car seat installment is commonplace. It was really shocking. I think, and this leads into my next point, that 80% of car seats are improperly installed. That was said on page 165. That was definitely a little scary to me, to know that there's that many children improperly seated in a car. But yeah. Number 4, are people hardwired for altruism or selfishness? When there are no risks involved for an individual, they generally act altruistically, as proven by the game/lab experiment Ultimatum, which is a really big thing in psychology. It's also being talked about in my social psychology, as seeing how influence comes over people. The author describes 3 factors that may influence the answer to this question: scrutiny, selection bias, and context. Human beings are ultimately guided by self-interest and incentive. For example, the kidney transplant system Iran has in place that pays a minimum of $1,200 for donations, instead of just, people altruistically donating those out of the goodness of their heart. But I can't blame them. Discernment and situational awareness plays a great part in this equation. There's no one answer to this question. Human beings are capable of altruism, but at our core, we are concerned with what a situation will do for us. John List's experiment provides insight into a behavioral statistical analysis and real-world examples of human interest. The baseball card and dealer scenario prove anonymity and reputation will guide our behavior. That was about how baseball card dealers from out of town would feel more likely to kind of rip people off, and then people that are local to the area that have a reputation are willing to kind of give a fair price. So that just kind of shows the influence of anonymity versus reputation. The game Ultimatum spun a narrative much more positive than reality, as once subjects had something to lose, there was a significant decrease in altruistic results. And I know this isn't a new concept, but I found it interesting how self-interested human beings are. We're not completely altruistic as we would like to think that we are. And when incentive and anonymity play a role in our decision-making, we will take the easier and more gainful option. Surprise, surprise. 5, is carbon dioxide the wrong villain? It is. The book describes that there are many villains discussed in Super Freakonomics, be it methane production from cattle farms or the production of black soot. Intellectual Ventures, which was a really big company discussed in the book, co-founder Nathan Myhrvold describes how water vapor may be a bigger villain than carbon dioxide, but it doesn't go into much more detail about water vapor. It just kind of moves on to talk about how carbon dioxide really isn't all that bad. Current climate models are not a good predictor of how any one dangerous greenhouse gas may be affecting the climate in a future time frame. So most of the research that we have now about future climate is actually pretty inaccurate. There's no one good way to really test and see what that will look like, because we don't have the technology for something like that yet. However, we do know that carbon dioxide has traditionally been a great source of energy for the photosynthesis process of plants, and the current amount of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere actually allows for decreased water consumption of plants and a vast increase in plant production, which is great for agriculture. So strictly speaking about carbon dioxide, the amount that is on Earth and in our atmosphere right now is actually pretty good. It's just, of course, there's a couple different other greenhouse gases and effects that are contributing to rapid change. And that's kind of the next part. That the biggest villain is the rapid rate of change. If it were going at a slower rate, these effects would not be nearly as concerning as they are. He also describes, or Ken Caldera, a researcher from Intellectual Ventures, does describe that trees are actually a major villain in the issue of global warming. And I've never heard this before, so I thought this was kind of funny. But trees with dark leaf coloring absorb an incredulous amount of sunlight, affecting temperature change in certain areas of planted trees. The description of Bedico's blanket, the ascribed solution to global warming, is laden with statistical analysis about how this plan could be implemented, And we already have real-world data that sulfur dioxide has a cooling impact due to the after effects of Mount Pinatubo's eruption. And that's a really big thing. Bedico's blanket is basically just a really, really long hose that would put sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, which is an effect proven by Mount Pinatubo's eruption. So we already have some real world kind of statistics to back that up, because it actually had great effects of cooling and putting that in a large scale plan. And they also go over like the financials of all of that. It's really not that much in order to slow warming down. Like, that's really startling that the information is out there that could work, and it has not been implemented yet. So yeah. This book really helps develop a better understanding of statistics, because it translates everyday questions like how much good do car seats do into feasible real-world statistics. Plain language is used as opposed to complex vocabulary and statistical symbols that may deter a common reader. Fortunately, the authors and researchers in this book provide a thorough step-by-step analysis of their methodology for each variable and outcome. Like the drunk walking example, I really liked how they took us step by step, and we're taking this statistic multiplied by this statistic, and that's how we're getting 21 billion miles walked by an average American each day. I thought that was really cool. And I also found the climate research to be damning, and it also just kind of goes to show how greedy we are as human beings, that if there's a plan like this that really doesn't cost that much and there's no negative aspect to it to implement, that it's just kind of scary that maybe it's greed that's ruining that process for us and not allowing us to implement it. But yeah, that's my super Freakonomics analysis, and now I'll move on to my empirical article analysis. My article 1, effects of brief mindfulness practice on reading performance among racially minoritized adolescents. This study is a year-long investigation into the effects of a daily 5-minute mindfulness practice and the impact this practice had on curriculum-based reading performances recorded at 3 different time points throughout the year. The sample population primarily consists of Black and economically disadvantaged students, which equals 56 for the sample size, who attend middle school in an urban area. The students in the treatment group were randomly assigned the brief mindfulness practice, which is described as the BMP condition, across 5 different English language arts classes, and some were not, creating the control group. Results recorded at the end of the year revealed that students in the mindfulness group achieved significantly higher scores when compared to those in the control group. And the brief mindfulness practice is a 5-minute daily practice where students are given a text and they are given some time to read it and analyze it, ask questions about it, and really dive into the literature that they're given so they can, comprehend things a little bit better. So yeah, it was found that those students did grasp their content by the end of the year, and they had much higher scores on their Ames web maze and also their STAR assessment, which are 2 pretty important statewide assessments given. It looks like the difference between the 2 groups was statistically significant, T equaling 2.52, P being 0.013. The second article, low early life socioeconomic status and susceptibility to the common cold in adulthood, the moderating role of negative affective reactivity. This study measures the effects of negative emotions and stressors on economically disadvantaged children and how this relates to their susceptibility to colds and infectious diseases later in life. The negative emotions described in this study are referred to as greater negative reactivity, or in simpler terms, higher stress levels and negative emotions. And this data about the NA reactivity is recorded multiple different ways through multiple different tests. This research relies heavily on the well-established link between individuals born into high poverty environments and their increased likelihood of exhibiting high levels of negative reactivity. The study involved 213 adult participants. One part of the study said 212, but when I actually looked at all of the information and the number of samples or just groups, what that added up to, It totaled up to 213, so to be more accurate, I just put 213 participants. They're all of good general health, and that's measured by a medical history questionnaire, a childhood socioeconomic questionnaire, a psychosocial survey, and multiple stress tests. The researchers hypothesized that the influence of a participant's parent owning their childhood home, which is their measure of socioeconomic childhood status, and their susceptibility to the common cold as an adult would be more pronounced in individuals with higher versus lower negative reactivity, innate reactivity. A hierarchical logistic regression model was performed to investigate if NA reactivity affected the relationship between years of parental home ownership and a subject's childhood and the susceptibility to the common cold. It was discovered that nearly a third of the subjects contracted rhinovirus, and this was through like a nasal drop exposure. They were kept in quarantine in a hotel room, and the way that they measured the sickness was the level of mucus accumulation in tissues. They actually measured that day to day, so I thought that was kind of interesting. There was an association found between fewer years of parental home ownership and lower educational attainment. Additionally, a correlation was observed between higher NA reactivity and greater baseline NA reactivity and higher emotional lack of stability. As predicted in the hypothesis, fewer years of parental home ownership was associated with an increased likelihood of developing a common cold in those with higher NA reactivity. B equaling negative 0.11, P equals 0.018, so that was significant. And confidence interval of 0.82 to 0.96. But not in individuals with lower NA reactivity, with a confidence interval ranging from 0.94 to 1.09. So yeah, I liked this study the most, but it was the most time consuming to get all of the information for. But it's really interesting. It kind of makes me think of, my childhood and how many times I went to the doctor, and receiving that extra care, I feel like probably did help when I am pretty susceptible to colds. So I don't know, it's just really interesting to see data, pretty anonymous data too, of people you don't hear the stories from, but you can see how this factor in childhood relates to them later in adulthood. I think that's really cool. But yeah, that is my final project review. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, please ask me in the comments. Thanks.